They came for sun and sea, for the postcard of swaying palms and turquoise surf. But if you stay long enough, the islands begin to speak in a different key, a low, patient voice that remembers what the shoreline forgets. This is not the Hawaii of travel brochures. This is the Hawaii that keeps its own hours. Theaters that deny the present, hotels that answer at midnight, valleys where footsteps return without feet. Here are 15 places across the islands where locals say something lingers, and where the most convincing proof isn't a legend so much as the small, repeatable traces people point to when they speak with a hush. Security footage, a guard's report, a chorus of witnesses years apart. Evidence locals fear most. Hawaii Theater, Oahu, downtown Honolulu. Once the beating heart of Honolulu's nights, the theater opened its doors to vaudeville and to a century of applause. The plaster angels still stare from the balcony. The skin of the building remembers every standing ovation and every hidden sorrow that passed behind the curtains. At night, the lobby takes on a particular smell, old wood and one single floral note, like tuberose, stuck under the lights. Audience seats sag in the same pattern they did 50 years ago. A stage light left on will sometimes bloom a halo on the floor that technicians swear vanishes the moment the bulb is checked. That small halo, reporters and maintenance workers say, shows up on camera too. A security feed from a week-long gig in 2017 captured a pale smear of motion crossing the stage between set changes. Technicians reviewed the footage and say there was no actor scheduled, no projection running. A custodian who worked the night shift describes a different kind of proof, a set of wet handprints on the backstage mirror, perfect as fingerprints, but without a matching body on any logbook. Locals warn visitors to keep a soft step in the corridors and to avoid peering into the wings after the house lights go down. A longtime stagehand told a reporter, quietly, that the theater keeps a rule. We never move the old white costume on the third hook after midnight. It reads less like superstition than institutional memory, a practice born from repeated inexplicable disturbances. The stage is only the beginning. Iolani Palace, Oahu, Honolulu. The stone and brass of Iolani Palace still hold the shape of a kingdom. It was once an official residence, and in the layers of lacquer and wallpaper, the island's political upheavals sit like a sedimentary record. Locals place the palace at the center of many stories. A sovereign who loved music, a court that dissolved into exile, rooms where decisions changed lives. In the empty rooms, the air is described as cool and deliberate, like the hush before a piano begins. Visitors and guides have reported a smell sometimes, not mildew, they insist, but a faint scent of gardenia or tuberose, as if someone had worn a corsage long ago. Several staff members who spend late hours cataloging artifacts say their equipment will fail in particular rooms. Cameras lose charge inexplicably. Digital recorders capture a whisper that drops out halfway through the file. A tour guide who works morning shifts remembers arriving once to find a formal chair pulled away from an office desk, as if someone had stood and gone without leaving footprints. The evidence that carries weight here is less the flash of a face than the consistency of small anomalies. A recurring recorded murmur, repeated electrical interference in the same gallery, a conservator's latex glove that turned cold in his hand while he rearranged items. For many locals, the palace is also a place of reverence. Signs and caretakers ask visitors to act respectfully, to remember that these rooms carry personal and political grief. No one speaks of dramatic hauntings the way one might tell a campfire story. Instead, people relive quiet disturbances and a firm sense that walls remember more than we do. On Oahu, the royal home refuses to sleep. Moana Surfrider, the First Lady of Waikiki. Oahu, Waikiki. The Moana Surfrider opened when Waikiki was still a place of tented hotels and carriage paths. Its lanai looks over the same water that once guided sailors and Ali. The hotel's lobby breathes of varnish and whitewashed palms, but after midnight the air, staff report, changes. A distant piano, the soft crest of a hymn, the faint impression of a woman moving through the corridors. Multiple employees have described the same motif, a slow, single melody, the type of tune a lounge pianist might play in the 1920s, heard through an otherwise empty bar. Security footage from the lower lobby captured something else, a shimmering presence passing behind a seated guest that the guest did not feel, and the cameras later showed as a vertical blur. Housekeepers offer a different catalog of traces. A fresh wetness on a balcony railing at dawn with no recent rain, a pressed floral impression on a pillowcase that disappears when the linen is changed.
A retired bellman said a former concierge kept a small rule. If it looks like a lady after lights out, close the door and leave her to the night. Staff described the ticket of a late-night musician who woke to find his saxophone sitting in the lobby, even though he had locked it away the previous evening. Guests and workers framed these incidents with caution. Many say they could be the product of old plumbing, hallucination, or the imagination tuned to the hotel's history. But repeated, similar accounts from different departments, bar staff, security, and housekeeping, have convinced others that the hotel remembers its past occupants in a tangible way. Visitors are asked to treat the building as a living archive and to follow the staff's guidance on access after hours.
Hilton Hawaiian Village, Oahu, Waikiki. The resort sits at the edge of the city and the sea, a modern sprawl on an older coastline. With millions of guests who cross its thresholds, stories accrue. One recurring figure, locals say, appears in a red dress along the beachfront walkways and in the glass corridors, a lady in red whose presence registers not in a scream, but in small, insistent phenomena. Security personnel have logged eerie electronics failures near the area where she is reported. In one incident, a guard on night duty reported in writing that his radio cut out when he approached a particular cluster of palm trees. On the security monitor, a camera briefly showed what looked like a reflection with movement inconsistent with the wind. Beach cleaners have found footprints leading to the water that stop at the tide line, as if the steps vanished there. Staff have also recorded the smell of salt and a floral note on nights with no breeze, a detail that shows up again and again in different testimonies. The hotel's public relations office does not comment on spectral claims, but long-term employees convey a set of local rules that reads more like cultural caution than a marketing quirk. Keep the walkways clear late at night, don't call out to figures on the beachfront, and respect the private rooms. For many on the island, the Lady in Red is less a frightening apparition than a reminder that even places designed for transient pleasure can collect the intense, private memories of 1,000 nights. Pacific Aviation Museum, Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. Ford Island is layered with war. The Pacific Aviation Museum sits within hangars where planes sat before and after conflict. Here, the dead are not only soldiers, but machines of violence and the crews that tended to them. That history leaves echoes, say mechanics and guides who work the displays. Rangers and retired pilots report hearing the distant thrum of an engine in hangars that are otherwise empty. Several former ground crew members described forensic evidence that still unsettles, instruments left in storage and later found turned to a setting the last technician would not have chosen, or a flight suit still draped over a rack that appeared at morning check without a recorded entry in the maintenance log. On one night in the early 2000s, a security camera recorded what staff describe as the silhouette of a figure in a flight jacket walking past an aircraft. The image, captured on an external camera, showed no one on the byline of the patrol logs. Museum curators and Navy personnel framed those captures with professional skepticism. Film artifacts, glare, and wiring faults are common in old installations.
But when former pilots and current docents, independently and across decades, report the same kinds of anomalies, smell of oil where no plane has been moved, the sensation of being watched among the cases of medals and squadron patches, the incidents gain an evidentiary weight that cannot be easily dismissed. There are also cautions. Certain hangars remain restricted, and caretakers ask visitors not to enter closed areas, both out of safety and out of respect for spaces linked to loss. Hulihei Palace, Hawaii Island, Big Island, Kailua Kona. Perched in the one-time summer retreat of Ali'i, this palace holds furniture and relics from an era when royals traveled through the islands. The house is a museum now, its rooms staged with 19th century decor and the hushed attention of visitors who come for history. Several caretakers report changes in temperature that cannot be explained by opening doors or shifting drafts. A docent on evening duty once placed his hand on the carved banister and felt the wood go ice cold beneath his palm, a sensation that lasted seconds but registered as profoundly wrong in the humid air. More tangible is a regular audio anomaly. Recordings made during after-hours inventory work captured what staff describe as a short, single chord on a piano in the parlor. No instrument was tuned, and no musician logged in to the museum's ledger. Security footage taken from the back gallery in 2011 shows a shadow crossing a doorway while the recorded tour group was in the opposite wing. The palace's stewards emphasize the museum status of the site and instruct visitors on the fragility of objects. At the same time, they remind guests to respect that these former royal spaces hold cultural weight. Treat this house like you would treat an elder, a longtime staff member advised, noting that the house's objects carry memory in a way that surpasses catalog notes.
Local practice asks that no one enter certain rooms when a staff member is present alone late at night. Manoa Valley, Manoa Falls Trail, Oahu. A green throat cuts through the city here. Manoa's stream and wet cliffs host a trail that has always been a place of stories. The rainforest can press close, and at dusk the path narrows into an intimate corridor of sound and smell. Hikers and residents report an immediate physical evidence, footsteps that come up behind someone, matching their pace, then stop without a visible person. Several longtime locals insist they have heard a slow, measured chant in the foliage on nights when no human group is present. A park ranger once found a series of footprints in mud that led up the path and ended at a thicket. The footprints were of bare feet, but showed no disturbance of the plants beyond a small, clean border. Other walkers say electronic devices fail in certain parts of the trail. Flashlights dim, GPS signals wander, and phone cameras sometimes show extra exposures.
The cultural warning associated with valleys like Manoa is often practical. Locals ask that people do not whistle at night on the trail. The rule functions on two levels, one ecological, to avoid disturbing birds, and one cultural, rooted in stories that treat whistling as an invitation to beings that keep certain routes. Park signage insists on safety and on respect for the land. Stay on marked paths, do not remove offerings if you find them, and avoid traveling alone after dark. Those cautions come from a mixture of safety concerns and a deeper communal memory of how one should enter places that hold history. Koloa Plantation, Kauai, Kauai. The old sugar mills and workers' cottages around Koloa are threaded into the island's labor history. Immigrant families, long shifts, and a landscape reshaped by industry. Those who grew up on Kauai often point to the plantation past as a source of stubborn stories about the weight of toil and the traces it leaves. Evidence here tends to be physical and domestic. Residents recount doors found unlocked when they remember securing them, kettles left boiling though no one had cooked, and the distinct impression of footprints across thresholds that lead nowhere. One farmer told a local paper that his security camera caught a cluster of faint, barefoot prints walking across his lanai before dissolving into the early morning fog. He added, carefully, that livestock and wind could account for some things, but the prints were too small and too precise to match other disturbances that happened on the property. Kauai elders often remind younger visitors, these lands were worked hard, and the spirits tied to them are not invitations for spectacle. Locals ask that tourists avoid trespassing on private sections of former plantations, and that they do not remove stones or offerings from yard shrines. In Koloa, the history of labor is a kind of lingering presence. The evidence locals cite is a catalog of interrupted domestic life. Pacific Coastline Lookout, Kauai Nepali Adjacent Cliffs, Kauai General Coastline. High cliffs and shifting winds produce optical tricks. Light can bend off the ocean, fog can press inland against the face of land, but at certain lookout points, people report phenomena that resist meteorological explanation. Night watchers recall headlights that appear on the cliff edge, then blink out. Fishermen describe a distant drum that sounds like someone calling across the water. Fishermen who check their lines at dawn have found strings of seaweed arranged in patterns on the rocks, as if left by hands. A Coast Guard auxiliary volunteer reported a recorded call on the radio of someone asking for help in an accent local to the islands, yet a search turned up no vessel and no person. Photographers shooting at sunset have developed rolls of film in which a single frame shows a blurred, human-shaped verticality in front of a rocky promontory, a detail absent in subsequent frames.
Residents emphasize two rules: do not approach cliff edges alone at night, and do not disturb small offerings left near the lookout. The coastline holds both dramatic beauty and old grief. Locals say the wind often carries echoes at night because of how the cliffs trap and return sound. Whether that explains drums across a bay is another question, but the repeated reports of the same sorts of anomalies over years is the reason watchers call it more than a coincidence. If you want the rest of this list and the evidence locals fear most, subscribe now. Kauai's shoreline and the plantation's cottages are a study in patience. The island holds what arrives and returns it slowly, sometimes altered. By the time these first 8 places have been traced, the pattern becomes clear: repeated small disturbances, sources that refuse simple explanation, and an overlay of local practice that treats some routes and rooms as kapu or forbidden for reasons beyond the municipal. But as the narrative tightens, the places that demand the most reverence are not always the grand hotels or the old mills. They are the sites where history sits thickest, where royalty rested, where warriors marched, where the land itself is called a deity and the offerings still gather. The list grows heavier when we step away from the stage lights and the resort lobbies and move toward the island's older axes of power: mausoleums that hold kings, lookouts that remember battle, and the crater rims where a name is spoken with both fear and devotion.
The next entries are the ones local families whisper about at dusk. They are the places that shaped the rules of caution passed down through generations. In those places, the evidence becomes less a flicker and more a chorus, more uniform, more insistent. Rangers and caretakers who have spent their lives on the islands are the ones who often speak most seriously about what they have recorded. Sustained chanting on an outdoor mic with no nearby group, fog that moves against wind, security footage that shows a line of shapes moving along a ridge while the cameras on either side register nothing. Respecting this, caretakers and community leaders ask visitors to follow posted rules and to avoid behaviors that turn sacred ground into spectacle. The night marchers, the royal spirits, the volcanic goddess, these names are invoked with care. People explain the protocols as cultural safety as much as superstition. Do not whistle along certain paths. Do not photograph inside mausoleums after hours. Bow low if you hear a procession where one is not expected. The protocols themselves are part of the evidence, a social index of places that have required limits for generations.
In the coming sections, the story narrows to 3 places that hold the most concentrated testimony. A mausoleum where repeated recordings capture deep, low chanting. A cliff where walkers describe phantom columns of figures moving along the ridge. And a crater-side hotel whose staff report an apparition that appears at sunset and at times when the house phone rings without a living caller on the line. Those sites gather the island's deepest histories: monarchy, war, and the active, venerated force many locals call Pele. Before stepping onto that ground, it is worth noting how the evidence under scrutiny here functions. A single video clip gains value when it is consistent with oral testimony, when different witnesses in different years describe the same sensory cue: the scent of tuberose in a sealed room, a piano note where no instrument exists, the abrupt failure of electronics in a single bay. In many cases, caretakers and guards have cataloged such incidents into institutional memory: logs, incident reports, and after-action notes that read like a careful, if unsettled, archive. Yet, even as they collect data, locals insist on limits. There are places that are closed for reasons that are both practical and sacred. Communities ask outsiders not to enter mausoleums, to avoid offerings left along trails, and to remember that some histories cannot be reduced to viral footage. That admonition is itself evidence, a social practice formed by a shared set of experiences that grew too numerous to ignore. Night approaches the islands differently than it does the mainland. Where golden hour photos end, the island's own histories begin to settle into the coastal air. As the list moves into its most charged entries, the accounts narrow from scattered anomalies into patterns that test the edges of journalistic caution and cultural respect. In those places, the evidence locals fear most is not a single photograph, but a network of consistent reports, the kind that has led caretakers to post signs and elders to issue informal prohibitions. When the next vignette begins, the story shifts from curiosities of architecture and tourism to the sites where lineage and land intersect, where a whisper can become a mandate. The island will ask you to listen differently. The proof, if proof it can be called, accumulates in small ways until it forms a particular gravity, and in the end, the choice to enter or to bow is not merely one of curiosity, but of consequence. The path upward from resorts and plantations leads into a different geography of authority. In that zone, the rules multiply. Do not step over offerings. Do not bring flash photography into certain enclosures. Do not attempt to mimic chants or rituals. Caretakers say those rules exist because of repeated encounters, not to frighten the curious, but to protect the community's ongoing relationship with what they call the island's remembering. The records that follow are not sensational trinkets. They are the logs of people who have returned to the same spots night after night and have written down what they found. Even here, the accounts are tempered with an awareness of alternate explanations. Photographic anomalies may be lens flare, cold spots may be drafts, faint drumming on a recorder may be a distant shipping horn. That caution is part of why these reports persist. The witnesses do not demand belief so much as record. It is the repetition across anonymous observers, guards, and long-term employees that creates weight. On the ridge ahead, caretakers whisper of processions, and in the vaults below a mausoleum, an audio file plays back a low, rhythmic chant that has not been matched with any scheduled ceremony. Staff who have cataloged these incidents keep copies in locked folders. Some files circulate only among established custodians. They will tell you that the trouble with such evidence is not that it proves anything definitive, but that it refuses to disappear. And yet the islands continue to draw visitors.
People come to stand where the ocean meets the reef, to watch the sun slump gold into the horizon, and to pretend for a day that beauty is uncomplicated. For those who stay, for those who begin to look for more than the postcard, the islands offer a different curriculum, one of restraint, a set of local rules that reads like an ethnography of caution. The cumulative pattern is clear. As you approach sites with the most cultural weight, the incidents become less sporadic and more like a chorus. That chorus will demand attention when we knock on the next doors. There is a final caution before we move on. These stories are not entertainment for the sake of a scare. Many of them stem from real grief, displaced families, wartime losses, laborers who worked until the land took them. Locals insist that curiosity be married to humility. Photographs can document, recordings can perplex, but none of those tools gives license to treat a place like a stage. With that in mind, the next entries on this list are ones where caretakers have, across years, collected the most consistent and culturally charged evidence. The stakes are higher. The rules are firmer. The voices who warn you are not telling tales to scare tourists. They are charting the boundaries of a living memory. The records grow heavier as you move inland, from stages to shrines, from lobbies to places that were always meant to hold memory. The next stops on the list are where history sits like weight, mausoleums that guard the names of rulers, ridgelines that remember the cadence of battle, and a crater where a goddess is still spoken of in the present tense. In each place, the kind of proof that residents speak about most often is not a single viral clip, but a pattern. Similar sensations, repeated anomalies, and the institutional logs of caretakers who have learned to write down the things that will not go away.
Mauna Ola, Royal Mausoleum, Nuuanu Valley, Oahu. The mausoleum sits low and composed among tropical growth, its stonework a deliberate answer to the rising humidity. It is called Mauna Ola in Hawaiian, the place where bones are laid, and for generations it has been a locus of formal mourning and familial remembrance. The architecture is spare. The air inside is cooler than it has any right to be in that climate. A lei left at the entrance will wilt in a different way than one left in a hotel lobby. It gathers a gravity. Caretakers who have worked at Mauna Ola for decades describe a class of evidence that they take seriously. One night, a staff member who performs cataloging work after hours set an audio recorder outside a chapel door and later found a file that contains a low, rhythmic chant lasting nearly a minute. He reports there was no scheduled ceremony. The logbook registered no visitors at that hour. Another steward who checks the grounds each dawn says motion-activated cameras along the perimeter once captured a procession of dim, vertical shapes moving toward the mausoleum gate. The images, he told a local reporter, showed nothing on the path between camera positions, even though the motion sensors tripped in sequence. Conservators have recorded their equipment losing power in the same wing repeatedly, not as random failures, but as a pattern localized to a particular corridor of tombs. The cultural stakes at Mauna Ola are explicit. Families and church groups visit to pay respects, and community leaders ask that outsiders follow posted rules. No flash photography after dusk, no loud speech in the mausoleum grounds, and no attempts to enter the vaults when caretakers are not present. This place is kapu for a reason, one longtime caretaker told a local interviewer, choosing the Hawaiian word that conveys restriction and sacred respect. Those restrictions are not theatrical. They are responses to accumulated encounters and to the community's desire to keep grief from being turned into spectacle. As the gate closes behind us in the record, the next site is already higher on the ridge, a lookout where wind and memory meet. Nuuanu Pali Lookout, Nuuanu, Oahu. The Pali looks down from a knife edge of basalt on a valley that has seen more than one decisive moment in the island's history. Its cliffs still remember conflict. In the late 18th century, a battle here pushed people over the precipice, and that loss has threaded itself into the place's long memory. The lookout's raw exposure to the elements makes it dramatic by daylight. At night, it is a different theater. Hikers who come up in the late afternoon and stay for the sunset speak of the wind doing strange things here. Several park rangers and longtime watchers report fog that moves inland against the prevailing breeze, an optical behavior they cannot reconcile with weather records.
More disquieting are repeated testimonies of columnar figures moving along the ridge in single file, seen by people on different nights and from different vantage points. One evening, a group of hikers recorded a short video on their phones. The footage shows a line of faint silhouettes gliding along the crest before the camera jitters and the exposure brightens. Then nothing. The hikers swore later they had heard the sound of sandals on stone at a cadence that matched older descriptions of marching. A park ranger who reviewed the file told a local news outlet that the audio channel picked up a low percussive rhythm that did not correspond to vehicular or animal noise. Rangers emphasize caution and cultural respect in equal measure. Family elders often advise visitors not to whistle along the Pali Road. The admonition is framed partly in practical terms, to avoid startling wildlife on narrow tracks, and partly as a cultural precaution. In the months when the dusk descends earliest, caretakers post extra signage and ask that visitors remain on the lookout side paths. When people describe what they have seen here, they do not use the language of spectacle. They say instead that the place keeps a register of what happened on it, and it will sometimes return a faithful echo. From the ridge, the route down the mountain returns you toward the sea and toward a crater that has been called a deity since before written records. There, the elemental behavior of earth and steam complicates every claim. At the volcano's rim, explanations must share the air with veneration. Volcano House and Kilauea Crater Rim, Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, Hawaii Island. Perched at the crater's edge, Volcano House has hosted travelers since the 19th century. Explorers, honeymooners, scientists, and visitors who came specifically to see a fire that refuses to be contained. The smell at the rim is sulfur and steam. Vapor rises off the ground like breath. For many locals, the place remains sacred because of Pele, the volcanic deity whose presence is invoked in stories and offerings. Staff and park personnel are careful with language here. They will say, "locals report," rather than "declare," but they also do not dismiss the weight of repeated accounts. Evidence that staff point to tends to be multimodal. Night shift attendants have recorded telephones ringing with no incoming caller and with no record on the switchboard. A front desk log contains entries where guests reported seeing a figure in older clothing on the balcony at sunset, only to find on inspection that no one had been there and the balcony door was locked in the morning. One kitchen manager described a case where fresh footprints appeared in the ash near the service entrance, leading to the door and stopping at the threshold as if whoever made them had vanished.
Security cameras mounted along the rim and on the house exterior once captured a vertical blur sweeping past a guardrail, while the wind, recorded on the same footage, was plainly coming from the opposite direction. Technicians who reviewed the footage told park staff that the motion could not be easily explained by wind or by camera artifacts alone. Park stewards and Hawaiian cultural practitioners insist on protocols around the crater. Visitors who travel to the summit are asked not to remove offerings, tea leaves, small stones, or lei, and staff recount getting calls from locals upset to find these items disrespected. Guides will advise, do not mock, do not imitate chants, and do not attempt to coax any response. It's about keeping a relationship, one park ranger said when describing the informal rules. It's not about proving something to strangers. For many people on the island, evidence of Pele's presence is less about a face in a camera and more about the way the place responds to disrespect. Sudden changes in weather, odd equipment failures localized to certain spots, and the persistence of offerings despite attempts to clear them. Leaving Kilauea's steam and brass light, the story moves to spaces of transit, places designed for motion that sometimes freeze with echoes of other times. Airports, hotels, and memorials keep their own register of late-night anomalies. Daniel K. Inouye International Airport, Honolulu, Oahu. Terminals are constructed to swallow time. They make waiting a neutral thing. But in the quiet hours, night shift crews at Daniel K. Inouye International Airport have a different set of phrases to describe what they encounter. Baggage handlers and security officers report seeing figures that do not register on manifest logs, and CCTV sometimes shows a passenger sitting on a bench who is gone in the recorded minutes between sweeps. One night shift security guard provided an incident report in which a camera over the arrivals hall shows a woman in period clothing on a bench at 2:14 a.m. The camera that sweeps the lower corridor minutes later records no individual, even though the bench remains plainly unoccupied in successive frames. The guard later found the bench cushion pressed as if weighted, then normal by morning. Another handler recalls reports of a lady in waiting who has been seen near an old chapel that predates the current terminal, a quiet presence that airport clergy describe as a figure of patience rather than menace. Flight crews have sometimes said the cabin lights flicker in a regular pattern on the ground that does not correlate with maintenance logs. Technicians note that older wiring and electromagnetic interference are plausible explanations, yet multiple crews independently reported the same sequence of flicker before a service history was recorded. Airport managers emphasize safety and respect.
They request that curious travelers not enter maintenance corridors or restricted chapels after hours, and remind people that much of the footage and incident reporting is sensitive to privacy and to solemn circumstances. The evidence that circulates among staff is used to develop procedures: why a nighttime check should be added here, why a chapel door should remain unlocked for pastoral care, rather than to advertise hauntings. In a place built for movement, the odd thing is how many workers say the tugs of the past can make time feel oddly still. The city yields back to the coast, and along a stretch where palms shade hotel facades, an older pink building keeps its story like a scar. The Royal Hawaiian, the Pink Palace, Waikiki, Oahu. The hotel's facade is coral pink and deliberate, an emblem of an era when resort hospitality became an industry in Hawaii. Inside, the reception hall preserves outre elegance: woven fabrics, carved lamps, and a corridor that smells faintly of gardenia and lemon oil. Over decades of staff rotations, the Royal Hawaiian has gathered a catalog of small, repeatable curiosities. Housekeeping logs handed to a local newspaper by a manager contain patterns: bed linens puckered in the center as if pressed, not by heat, but by the distinct impression of a form. Single glass lipstick marks on champagne flutes, left in rooms reserved for long-departed guests. A recorded instance of a mirror fogging in a precise oval, even though the bathroom fan had been on and the thermostat low. Security footage from the ballroom in the 1990s, circulating privately among veteran staff, shows a slow-moving shadow descending a staircase in a line that some describe as too deliberate to be passing staff, the kind of image that gets filed and referenced rather than broadcast. A concierge who worked late into the night once logged a guest who requested her old room, a suite that had been decommissioned decades earlier. The logbook recorded the request and the suite's vacancy. Long-term employees describe soft rules more than phantoms. Leave closed service doors closed. Do not enter wings reserved for private events without an escort. And when guests ask, direct them to staff rather than indulge curiosity. The hotel's public relations office declines to speculate and frames these stories as part of the institution's folklore. The staff's private files, however, reflect a pattern of recurring disturbances that several departments, housekeeping, security, and the front desk, acknowledge independently. From a pink corridor to a crater, from a mausoleum to a memorial, the list concludes with a place that asks for your quiet attention rather than your fear. National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, Punch Bowl Crater, Oahu. Carved into a volcanic crater and set with rows of white markers, the cemetery is an intentionally solemn space. Flags fold in formed hands. On certain afternoons, the light takes on a reverent angle, and the wind steps through the trees like a respectful guest. Because it is a place of recent and remembered warfare, its visitors' encounters are often framed as echoes rather than specters. Security personnel who have patrolled the cemetery after hours report a common report: the sensation of marching when no ceremony is scheduled. A volunteer who maintains grave sites for visiting families left a small digital recorder near the columbarium one evening, she told a local paper, and months later discovered an audio file that records a distant rhythmic tread and a low drum beat lasting nearly 2 minutes. She swore there had been no organized event at the time. Another guard filed an internal report after hearing on a clear night a sequence of metallic clanks like boots on a paved path. His nightly log shows he inspected the gates and found nothing untoward. The archive of incident reports kept by cemetery staff is cautious in language but consistent in content. The same kinds of noises at different hours, the same sensation of presence without visible form. The cemetery's leadership strongly urges that visitors adhere to rules of decorum, stay on paths, do not cross roped areas, and maintain respectful silence. They also note that the site's topography can create acoustic illusions. The crater shape channels sound in ways that confuse the ear. Even so, it is the repetition of particular auditory experiences, captured in logs and in a few recorded files, that gives staff pause. For those who come here at dusk to watch flags lower, the feeling is not of horror, but of a thickened attention to another kind of continuity, to those who once moved in formation and those who continue to be remembered. Across these 15 stops, the same evidentiary loads recur: footage and images that refuse simple explanation, recorded sounds that have no scheduled source, physical traces that appear and then cannot be empirically tied to a person,
and the careful, written logs kept by caretakers and guards who have an institutional stake in noticing. The locals' rules, do not whistle, do not remove offerings, do not trespass, function as part of that evidentiary record. They are social technologies for managing interaction with a landscape that remembers. There is also an ethics at play. For many who live on these islands, the plea is not that visitors believe or disbelieve, but that they behave with humility. Photographs can be taken, footage can perplex, but the community's insistence on boundaries is not an invitation to thrill-seeking. A cultural practitioner once summarized the attitude this way: "We are not trying to prove ghosts to anyone. We are asking you to leave the places that keep our ancestors to us." So what do we make of the evidence locals fear most?
It is, first, relational, repeated, independently reported events that accrue across time. Second, institutional, files, logs, and security footage preserved by organizations with reasons to track anomalies. Third, cultural, rules and prohibitions that persist because a community has found that they work to protect something valuable. No single clip or file resolves the question. But when a piano chord plays in an empty parlor, when a line of silhouettes is captured on a ridge, when telephones ring and no caller appears at the desk, those are the kinds of particulars that, taken together, demand attention. If you come to these islands only for the sun, you may never notice. If you stay long enough, you might begin to hear the places themselves asking for courtesy. Respect does not preclude curiosity. It shapes it. Travel journals and contested footage will continue to arrive online, and skepticism and explanation will have their due. Yet the caretakers who file the reports, the elders who repeat the cautions, and the rangers who close gates at night will keep their own records. They will continue to ask visitors to avoid turning the lived grief of places into a spectacle. If you dared to watch until the end, subscribe and join us for the next chapter. The hauntings continue. And if you ever visit these sites, remember that evidence is not only what a camera captures, it is also the way a community chooses to live with the past. Respect the rules. Honor the places that remember.